All right, so as promised, I just terminated the previous video, which covered the Nexus dashboard user interface, and now I'm picking up here to cover the multi-site orchestrator interface. So multi-site orchestrator has technically been rebranded to Nexus dashboard orchestrator, and so it should read as such over here on the left. I just think this is an older version of Nexus dashboard, and an older version of this particular service or application running on the dashboard, and so it doesn't reflect that rebranding just yet. But the idea is still the same. Multi-site orchestrator is at a high level a product that can be used to deploy policy across multiple different data center fabrics and multiple different data center fabrics of different types. So you can configure policy that stretches across different ACI fabrics. You can also configure policy that stretches across different NDFC fabrics, which is to say different NXOS networks that run VXLAN EVPN. So anyway, one of the first things that you need to do when you get the multi-site orchestrator or Nexus dashboard orchestrator application service up and running is going to be here under the infrastructure tab. So since this is an app running on the Nexus dashboard platform, we have already come up here to sites, and we have added 2 sites. We've got San Francisco, we've got New York. These are essentially, we can see if we click on San Francisco, we can see 2 leaves, 2 spines, 3 controllers. So this is an ACI network. If we look at New York, we have the same thing: 2 leaves, 2 spines, 3 controllers. All of them are running the same version of software. So we've added the sites at a platform level, but then we need to add those sites at an application level, right? At the NDO level. So we've already done that here, and the way that happens, right, is because the app is running on the platform and we've already added the sites to the platform. The sites automatically show up within the app, but we came in here and we changed the default of unmanaged to be managed, and that is what allows the multi-site orchestrator to basically control those fabrics. Otherwise, it would just be an app running on the platform, but it wouldn't really be doing anything. That kind of reminds me that I think we need to go back and we need to look at the system overview. By status, maybe it wasn't that, maybe it was dashboard. Yeah, 2 sites. There was somewhere, it was showing, maybe it was under sites. Yeah, here we go, services used. So in the previous video, when we first added these sites, no services were used, right? Because theoretically we hadn't even installed a service yet, which is Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator. But then we had not yet come into Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator and told it to manage the sites that we added. So changing this to manage here is what causes this multi-site orchestrator badge to show up under services used on the platform itself. Okay, so that's the first thing that you're going to do. In terms of system configuration, again, that's kind of like cluster configuration over here on the platform. These are settings that are going to apply to the multi-site orchestrator application, so you can use a proxy for that to communicate outbound if needed. And then infra configuration. This is essentially configuring all of the OSPF, MP, BGP, EVPN connectivity that comprises the underlay for multi-site. So this is how you connect. This is how you connect multiple ACI fabrics together across your inter-site network, whether that be dedicated switching, or I think it can also be an MPLS network, etc. Okay, so this is how and where that gets configured. So you click on Configure Infra here, and I don't think I'm going to go through all these steps, but I want you to know where the settings are. So we can see that, for general settings, you have control plane BGP. So again, this is your full mesh by default. BGP, EVPN connectivity between all your spines and your different sites, right? So that's what allows the fabrics in those different sites to communicate. I believe this IPN devices has to do with the cloud APIC, which I'm not going to cover in this video, so I'm not going to cover this here, but I believe that that's what that is for. What you do is you add an IPN device, I believe, on your local network, and then that IPN device IP address establishes tunnels to, I think, 2 different virtual CSR routers that are deployed in the public cloud. Now here under sites, these are the sites that we added to the platform. These are the sites that we told multi-site orchestrator to manage. So we would need to configure all of the underlay connectivity for multi-site to function properly. So to do that, you need to do that per site. And so you would start by choosing a context of the spine. And this is where you would add the ports that are connected to your inter-site network, whether that be, like I said, 9K switches or an MPLS network. You would add your port here, your IP address here. If you're using OSPF, you're going to want to use the policy default, or you can create your own point-to-point is typically what is used. And you can configure authentication if you like. Default MTU is 92.16. Okay, and then once you add a port, there's going to be an option down here for BGP peering, and you can set up your BGP EVPN router ID down here. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that pretty much covers it. Then you're going to go away from the spine context, and you're going to click on the pod context, so you can kind of see how spine is highlighted here. You'd also want to configure your other spine. Then you click on pod. Here you can configure your overlay unicast TEP. So this covers, I believe, VXLAN encapsulated traffic between your fabrics. And then you would go ahead and click on the site context. Here you would enable multi-site. You would configure your overlay multicast TEP. I believe this is your what's otherwise referred to as your head-end replication TEP, which is just more efficient for sending lots of traffic between your fabrics. And if you scroll down, you've got your external routed domain and your BGP autonomous system number, which should be unique for this site. Okay, and then if you are using MPLS backbone for your inter-site network, then I suspect that SR MPLS connectivity would need to be configured. I'm not going to cover that in this demo. Okay. Also under underlay configuration, you have your OSPF area and your OSPF type. We normally set that up to regular, but it could also be NSSA, and that's referring to the devices that you're connecting to within your inter-site network. You've also got your OSPF policy down here, which again, by the default is point-to-point. And I think that's all we need to cover for our overlay and underlay configuration. At that point, once you do that for each of your sites, then you would deploy those configurations. And if you do that for multiple sites, then you have sites available to, be able to deploy policy across multiple of those sites. So I'm not going to be able to actually demonstrate much since I'm not configuring all of those parameters in this demonstration. There's also some integration between Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator and SD-WAN. I've heard of this, but I haven't yet read about it, so I can't comment on exactly what this integration provides at this time. Now, in terms of operations, this is specifically operations that have to do with Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator. So just like on the cluster under operations, you've got audit logs, backup and restore, site firmware. This is actually, for me, this is relatively new information or new functionality. What I mean by that is, my ACI experience dates back a little ways, and you used to have to log into each site's APIC cluster and upload new firmware images and perform software upgrade operations from each unique APIC cluster per site, right? So here it looks like that can happen here now. So you can go to Cisco Software Download Center. You can grab the appropriate images. You could potentially set up download over the internet, perhaps, or upload those images here. And then you've got a list of controllers which run one type of image, and nodes. These are your spine and leaf switches that run other types of images. And so here you can kind of get an idea of, what's the status, right? What version of software are your controllers running in San Francisco? What version of software are your spine and leaf switches running in San Francisco? What's happening in New York, etc. So you can do, I believe you can do all of your firmware management activities now from one central location across all of your sites worldwide. You've also got a tech support functionality here where looks like you can probably create and download logs. And then remote locations, I believe, is for your backup and restore instead of all of this being held within the Nexus dashboard Orchestrator application, or perhaps even on the Nexus dashboard platform. You can probably offload these to let's check, HTTP or SFTP server or something like that. So probably when you set up your backup and restore, you can point it at, a location. This is all local, but you would be able to point it at a remote location. Remote. And then this drop down would be populated based on the remote locations you configured here. Okay, so that covers infrastructure and operations, and then we get into the meat of multi-site Orchestrator. Having already added our sites to the dashboard, which we can see here, we then need to get into pushing policy across those sites. So that really starts with tenants. So we have common tenant, which if you're familiar with ACI has a similar meaning there. Infra tenant, which has a similar meaning there. This DCNM default tenant is really meant for, I think, NDFC managed sites, which we're not going to cover in this video. And then, of course, we can add our own tenants. So here you would basically type in, new tenant name, whatever you wanted to name it. And then you would come down here to the sites and you would say save. And that would deploy that tenant to those sites. So how can I access those sites? Let's see here. Can I open? Yes. Okay. So if I come here under infrastructure, sites, I see my sites, and then I can open a PIC user interface for San Francisco. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at that and see if it actually pushed the tenant, considering I didn't actually set up the underlay. Okay, I can also open up the APIC for New York. I'll put that on the right since that's on the East Coast. Okay, so let's get rid of this. And if I look at tenants, did it get it? It did, new tenant name. Okay, and if we look at the second fabric, it should have that tenant as well. Okay, so the workflow here, right, is you add sites to the Nexus dashboard platform. You then come into sites in a particular application and you change those sites to be managed by that application. Okay, you then add tenants and you bind tenants, like we just did here, to different sites, and you allow users to manage that tenant in those sites. Okay, so assigned users. And then here you can see assigned schemas is currently 0. And a schema is really just a container for different templates that you can deploy across these sites that are in, that this tenant belongs to. When you push configurations, you can push them to all sites for that tenant, or you can just push to one site for that tenant. It really just depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So, so you add sites, then you add tenants to those sites, then you are going to go into schemas. These policies here, I actually haven't read about these policies. You can add all kinds of different policies, and my assumption is that these can then be assigned to, it looks like a specific tenant, And then because the tenants are assigned to the sites, these policies would apply to one or multiple sites, depending on where that tenant is distributed. Okay, but the main policies that you're used to configuring are things like VRFs and bridge domains and application network profiles, EPGs, subnets, contracts, filters, external EPGs, L3 outs. All of those things are going to be set up and determined here under schemas. So you can come over here and add your first schema. And if you read the documentations, there's multiple different ways to skin a cat, right? So you can create one schema with all your templates and then assign templates to certain sites and deploy. Or you can create separate schemas. Maybe one schema has a template for all your network objects and another schema has templates for all your application policy. There's a lot of different ways to handle this. The way I've done it in the past is to create one schema and then a template for each individual site so that I can push policy to each individual site, and then a separate template for multiple sites that are, like a shared template where when I configure something under that template and push it, it pushes to all sites. So that's what I would typically do for something like stretched bridge domains. In any case, you can name your schema. We'll just call it schema 1 for now. It doesn't really matter. Okay, and then we're going to want to add a template. So we would create a template, and then here you determine a type. So if this is ACI multi-cloud, again, it describes what this is for. So this would be for establishing connectivity between ACI fabrics that are on-prem, so site to site. You can also use this for ACI site to public cloud site running the cloud APIC. And you can also do cloud to cloud sites, so cloud APIC to cloud APIC. Networking, this is for DCNM or what has now been rebranded NDFC site-to-site connectivity. And SRMPLS, it says on-prem ACI site local only. I'm assuming that this means that the inter-site network is using MPLS backbone. I haven't actually read about this yet, so I'm not going to discuss it here. But what we're going to do is select ACI multi-cloud. And based on that, over here on the right, we're going to want to bind this template to a tenant. And this is our new tenant name. So again, consider, right, that the template maintains these configurations that we're going to look at in a minute. And then the tenant gets bound to the template gets bound to a tenant. And when we created the tenant, we assigned the tenant to 2 sites. That's how come we see this new tenant name in both of these sites, right? This is San Francisco, and this is New York. Okay, so keep that in mind, right? When you attach your template to a tenant, essentially by object hierarchy or inheritance, the template is getting assigned to multiple sites. Okay, so then you can come over here and start creating a configuration. So I'm only going to just do one simple thing here. We're just going to add a VRF. We will call it VRF1. And if I scroll down, there's not a whole lot else to do here other than maybe policy enforcement. And enforcement is enforced by default. We can't change it. We can change our data plane learning and other settings. But that's the basic idea, right? And now that the template is configured, I can save the template to the multi-site orchestrator or Nexus dashboard orchestrator application. This doesn't actually deploy any configurations out onto the fabric. Okay, so if I go back to site 1, click on new tenant name, site 2, new tenant name, and then drill down to networking and look at VRFs, we have nothing. Okay, we can see that this site or tenant was created by multi-site because it's got this little cloud icon in the UI. Okay, so we haven't deployed this VRF to my tenant name across those 2 sites yet. In order to do that, you can either come here and you can add this template to one or multiple sites, or vice versa, you can add sites and then assign a template to it. So here I'm going to say this template is assigned to both sites as shared. So this is kind of what you would need to do for, let's say, a stretched bridge domain. In fact, it won't take much more effort to go ahead and show that. And bridge domains connect to VRF. So we'll go ahead and add a bridge domain. We'll just call it BD1. We'll tell it to use the VRF that we just configured. And down here, you've got these sites, or these settings. So L2 stretch just means that whatever subnet you configure down here under subnets is going to be configured and exist and have a gateway IP in both data centers, San Francisco and New York. Okay. Intersite bum traffic allow means that you're enabling flooding. Okay. And so if you had L2 stretch enabled, but you didn't have bum traffic allowed, then that use case would be good for, let's say, cold migration, meaning you could shut down a VM in data center 1, you could move the files over to data center 2, and you could then bring that VM back online without changing its IP address. If you want to do live migration, or you want to do database clustering, where live migration, you want to vMotion a machine from data center 1 to data center 2 while it's running with the same IP address, you would need intersite bum traffic allow. If you wanted to have, let's say, a VM in San Francisco and another VM in New York, and you wanted those two VMs or physical machines to be running database software and establish a database cluster across the data centers for site redundancy, then you would need intersite bum traffic allow for that use case also. And then optimize WAN bandwidth. I believe that this basically tells this bridge domain to make use of the head-end replication TEP that we configured earlier, or the multicast overlay TEP, just because it's more efficient to use multicast to send traffic over your WAN than it is to use unicast traffic over your WAN. So just another setting there. The rest of these settings I won't configure, but what I will point out is that if you uncheck layer 2 stretch and confirm, then the ability to configure a subnet in this bridge domain is removed, and that becomes a site local configuration because you're not going to share the same subnet across both locations. Okay, so keep that in mind. But that gives kind of a quick introduction to configuring a bridge domain here in Multi-Site Orchestrator. If you highlight the bridge domain object, maybe I have to save it. Yeah. If I highlight the bridge domain object, you can see that it is connected to VRF1. And if I highlight VRF1, you can see that it is connected to bridge domain 1. So kind of a nice little trick in the GUI to be able to see how multiple objects relate to each other. Okay, so now that I've got that, I've saved my template. And I can see that I've attached my template to these two different sites. Again, that's optional. I don't have to do that. It depends on whether I want to push this VRF and bridge domain settings. Since I did configure L2 stretch, then I'm going to go ahead and configure a shared subnet gateway. So we'll just call this 10.10.10.1/24 just for kicks. Okay, and save those policies. Now, if I want these policies to be pushed to both sites, then I join this template to both sites as I already have. If I decide I want to remove a site from that template, here I would be removing New York from template 1, meaning these settings would not, I could delete the template from that site, meaning that those configurations would not get pushed to New York. This little sort of warning badge here basically is indicating, hey, you've updated the template for template 1 in Multi-Site Orchestrator, but you haven't pushed those configurations to the site. So the site config is not in sync with the Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator. Another way that can happen once you're in production is someone can make site local changes, and then you also would not match, right? Your orchestrator would be missing configurations that are now existing on your fabric. So this would come up and it would kind of help you learn what is the source of the configuration drift. Who's at fault? Is it because I have configurations in NDO that I haven't pushed to the fabric, or is it because I've introduced fabric configurations independent of NDO? Okay, so all that's left to do at this point is to go ahead and click on the template and click deploy to sites. And it should take these configurations and summarize what's going to happen. I'm going to take this VRF and I'm going to create it in both locations. I'm going to take this bridge domain, I'm going to create it in both locations. And if we remember, we configured a 10.10.10.1/24 subnet on the bridge domain, so it should take care of that too. If I click deploy and we wait, it should push these policies to both Apex okay. And if I look at site 1, there's my VRF1. If I look at the bridge domain, there's BD1. If I look at my subnet, 10.10.10.1, and if I look at site 2, which is New York, there's my VRF, there's my bridge domain, there's my subnet. Same subnet in both sites. Now, this isn't going to function properly because remember, I didn't actually deploy my config infra. I didn't deploy my underlay. So BGP EVPN underlay that allows, let's say, VXLAN encapsulation across your intersite network, none of that is set up, right? So this isn't actually going to function, but it did turn out to be a successful demo of how multi-site policy is pushed across different sites. Now, if you wanted to undo this, right, if you wanted to essentially get rid of configurations, then you can take template 1 and you can undeploy the template from New York. It says here, please note that policies added locally on site will also be deleted. So you need to be careful there. So this is New York. And if I go to New York, we're now missing our bridge domain and our VRF, but in San Francisco, we still have them. So I can then remove them from San Francisco if I would like. See if I'm fast enough. No, not fast enough to catch it, but they're gone. Okay, and once that's done, our template is still assigned to these sites, right? So I can add sites. How can I remove sites? Can I delete this template from the site? Yes, I can. So this would remove the association from the template to the site. Okay. And now that I have no association for these configurations going to any sites, I can save this, I can exit out, and then I can potentially just delete the entire schema, right? So let's go back here to tenants real quick. We can see that new tenant is assigned to 2 sites, 1 user, and 1 schema. But if I come, okay, change it here, edit, assign schemas, I don't see schemas on this side, so you have to delete the association from the schema side. So tenants, there we go. So I can edit which tenants, yeah, it takes me into the schema. So basically I can schema, template, tenant settings, new tenant name. So I can't edit the tenant that's associated here. So the only thing that I can really do, and it makes sense because I'm not applying any of these configurations to any sites at this point, is to go ahead and just delete the schema. So I can delete the schema here. And now when I come back to tenants, we see no schema attached to the tenant. And then, theoretically, I could delete the tenant altogether, right? Because we don't necessarily need it. So I'll go ahead and do that. And then if I go back, we should see new tenant name disappear from the fabric. Or I think I read about how you can leave the configurations behind, and it just means that Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator isn't going to manage those configurations anymore. So now anything that exists in these tenants becomes managed site local APIC rather than through NDO. Okay, so that's, I think, a pretty quick, pretty fair demonstration of multi-site orchestrator. running on the Nexus dashboard platform, showing how both of those things integrate. Hopefully that was useful, and thanks for taking the time to watch.